I'm Michelle Holbrook, 54, and I spent 31 years earning every inch of my place in uniform. For years, I carried Richard Baxter's weight, covering mistakes, opening doors, and staying silent while he questioned everything I had built. But when I was shoved in a Pentagon cafeteria and he chose to look down at his phone instead of standing up, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you protected, helped, or believed in? Tell me in the comments you're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, dignity, and taking your power back. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up in a house where rank was sewn on by hand. My mother's rule, you keep what you earn. My father's rule, everything you earn comes with weight. I didn't understand either one until much later, but they were right about all of it. The night my father made colonel was a Tuesday in 1982. I was 10 years old, standing in a gymnasium at Fort Leavenworth in dress clothes that itched at the collar. The ceremony was small, with no band, no crowd of strangers, just the unit and a few officers' families, and the flat Midwestern light coming through the high windows. I watched the eagle insignia get pinned to my father's shoulders by a general whose name I have long since forgotten, and I thought it looked like the end of something. It was actually the beginning. That evening at the kitchen table, Colonel James Graves explained the promotion in the plain, unhurried way he explained most things. He didn't use the word power. He used the word weight. More people depending on his judgment now. Less room for error. More decisions that couldn't be walked back. I asked whether that scared him. He looked at me like the question surprised him, and then he said no. He said weight was the point, the whole point. My mother was at the sewing machine in the corner of the kitchen, working on the dress uniform shirt that would carry the new rank. She didn't look up from the needle when I asked why he didn't just buy new shirts. My father laughed. Eleanor Graves, born June 5th, 1945, did not laugh. Because he earned these, she said without breaking her stitch. You keep what you earn. I have heard her say 100 things over the course of my life and remembered perhaps a dozen. That one I will carry until I can't anymore. We moved to Fort Leavenworth in 1982 when my father's promotion brought us west from Georgia. The neighbors were all military families. The school organized itself around the calendar of the post. Fathers and, increasingly, mothers came and went on schedules set by someone else's operational requirements, and the families reorganized around each absence without drama, because drama was a luxury the structure didn't have room for. You adapted, you waited, you kept the table. My father, James Graves, was born April 10th, 1940. He was a Vietnam-era officer who had entered service in a different army and adapted without complaint to each successive version of it. He was not warm in the way the word gets used loosely. He was warm in the way that counted, present, specific, and honest. I watched him through my childhood with the particular attention of a daughter who had decided, without articulating the decision, to study someone closely. It took me another decade to understand that paying attention was exactly what he had been teaching me to do all along. In 1988, he retired. We settled in Athens, Georgia, where my mother had family. My father adjusted with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. He built a garden, he read extensively, he attended every school event I had, and always sat in the back row. When I asked him once why he always chose the back, he said a good officer watches the whole room. I thought he was joking. He was not joking. In 1990, I enrolled at the University of Georgia on an Army ROTC scholarship. I want to be precise about why I chose ROTC because it matters to the shape of the story. I had grown up watching people who led with clarity, held themselves accountable to something larger than personal comfort, and measured their success by the quality of the thing rather than the applause it received. I wanted to be one of those people. ROTC at Georgia in the early 90s was not a large program. There were 4 women in my first year out of roughly 40 cadets total. I was not the fastest in the field. I was not the loudest in the room. I was, from the first week, technically precise in a way my cadre commander noticed before I noticed it in myself. He told me in my first formal counseling session, "You read rooms well. That is rarer than fast and it lasts longer than strong." I wrote it down that night and kept the card for 2 years until it went soft at the edges. At a joint ROTC leadership summit in the spring of 1993, I met Richard Baxter for the first time. He was a cadet from the Citadel, born November 3, 1972, 9 months younger than me, though he carried himself as if the calendar ran in his favor in all things. He was tall and confident and filled space easily. We were assigned to the same tactical planning team for a 4-hour exercise. I did the terrain analysis. I built the logistics matrix. I ran the communications plan from start to finish. Baxter presented the result to the evaluating officer with fluency and confidence, using first-person plural in a way that technically included me, but practically did not. Afterward, he found me outside in the early afternoon sunlight. He said, "You did most of that. I know it." I looked at him and tried to determine whether he was apologizing or simply noting a fact he found interesting. I couldn't tell. "Just make sure you use it well," I said. It was the most generous thing I would say to him for the next 30 years. In 1994, I was commissioned as a second lieutenant, 01, and assigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Baxter was commissioned the same year and assigned to the same post. He went to a platoon in a higher profile battalion. I was assigned to a support platoon in a less visible unit. I requested a transfer to a more competitive assignment and was denied. I led my platoon to the highest score in the battalion's next readiness evaluation. I did not request a transfer again. In 1996, I was promoted to First Lieutenant, 02, and deployed to Bosnia-Herzegovina as part of NATO's stabilization force. I was 24 years old. The work, reading the room, holding the variables, making sound decisions in the gap between what the plan said and what the ground actually showed, felt like the thing I had been built to do. I met David Holbrook at a USO event in Tuzla. He was the son of a Marine, which meant he understood the shape of military life without needing it explained from scratch. In the summer of 1998, after I was promoted to Captain 03 and assigned to Fort Hood, I married him in a small ceremony at Fort Benning. In 2003, I deployed to Iraq with Operation Iraqi Freedom. I was 31 years old and commanding a forward support company in Mosul. During a joint resupply operation, Baxter miscalculated a manifest in a way that would have triggered an adverse report and possibly ended his captain's evaluation on a negative note. I caught the error 2 hours before it became visible to anyone above us. I rewrote a portion of my own unit's allocation to cover the gap and filed the paperwork in a way that absorbed the problem entirely. Baxter thanked me generally for the seamless coordination. He never learned what I had actually done. I told myself it was professional discretion, that good officers didn't keep scorecards. Looking back, I know it was something else. I was already carrying his weight. I simply hadn't named it yet, even to myself. By the end of that deployment, I had been earmarked for early promotion to major. The final image I carry from those years is a Fort Hood promotion ceremony, a major's gold oak leaf being pinned to my collar by David, who was beaming and present and proud, while Baxter raised a glass from across the room and met my eyes with genuine warmth. Everyone in that frame was still exactly who they said they were. That would not always be true. But in that moment, standing in the light of a Texas afternoon with rank I had earned pinned to my uniform by a man who believed in me, it was true. And I am glad it was, for exactly as long as it lasted. Between 2005 and 2018, the gap between what I contributed and what Richard Baxter acknowledged widened in increments small enough to dismiss one at a time, but impossible to ignore when you laid them end to end. He made comments at parties I chose not to repeat to anyone. He accepted assignments I had personally vouched for him to receive, then reframed my advocacy as his own professional merit when it suited him. When the promotion boards began separating us, my trajectory moving upward, his stalling in place, the respect he had once offered me with apparent sincerity curdled into something that looked, from a distance, like bitterness, and from close range, looked like a decision he kept making over and over again. In 2005, I used my established relationship with my brigade commander to advocate for Baxter's assignment to the Pentagon G3 staff. The billet was genuinely competitive. He was qualified, but the field was strong enough that my direct recommendation made a material difference. I did not tell him I had done it. I told myself the professional relationship between us was reciprocal enough that the accounting would eventually balance itself without anyone having to say the numbers aloud. I was wrong about that in a way that took me another 12 years to fully understand. In 2006, I was a major, 04, at an officers' social gathering at Fort Myer, following a change of command ceremony. I was 6 feet from Baxter when he explained my career trajectory to a fellow major I didn't know well. "She's exceptional, absolutely," he said. "But you've got to acknowledge the system is working in her favor. The Army's checking boxes right now." He saw me standing there. He did not change his sentence. He did not lower his voice even slightly. He didn't lower his voice. That was the detail I couldn't set down afterward, no matter how many times I tried. He wasn't hiding it. He wanted me to hear it. In the car, David asked if I was okay. I said yes. I did not tell him what I had heard, because telling him would have required me to explain why it landed the way it did, and I didn't have the language for that yet. What I had instead was a decision. The most powerful response to that kind of remark was to continue becoming exactly who I was, without adjustment, without reduction, without giving it the dignity of a reaction. I still believe that. It still cost me something real, every single time I had to enact it. In 2007, Baxter was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel 05, 1 year ahead of me. For approximately 18 months, he outranked me by 1 pay grade. He began prefacing suggestions to me with, "As your senior, I'd recommend," in contexts that had no tactical requirement for the designation at all. At a shared lunch in early 2008, he offered me extensive, unsolicited advice on how to frame my upcoming officer evaluation report. He had been behind a desk for 2 years. I had just returned from my second Iraq deployment. I thanked him for the thought and wrote the report myself. It earned the highest rating my rating chain could assign. I noted that. I did not mention it to him. In 2011, during my deployment to Afghanistan with Operation Enduring Freedom, I earned a Bronze Star with Valor following a complex and coordinated attack on the forward operating base where I was stationed. I organized the medical evacuation of 3 soldiers under ongoing incoming fire, while simultaneously maintaining communications with higher headquarters. I wrote David a letter that night that was the only one in the entire deployment where I allowed myself to be fully honest. "I'm tired in a way I didn't know was possible before this year," I wrote. "But I know what I'm doing here and I know why it matters. I need you to hold on a little longer." His reply arrived 3 weeks later. It was kind and it was 3 sentences long. He had been promoted at his engineering firm. He had been traveling for a new project. The apartment felt too quiet. 3 sentences, after 7 months of separation and 1 genuinely dangerous spring. I told myself it was enough. I was still at 39 very good at telling myself that things were enough when they were not. Baxter sent a congratulatory text when the Bronze Star citation was formally published. "Well deserved. Always knew you had it." It was warm, and it sounded like him at 21. It was the last purely warm message he would ever send me. In 2012, we were both promoted to Colonel 06 in the same promotion cycle. In 2013, I was assigned to the 82nd Airborne as a brigade-level staff officer. Baxter received a schoolhouse assignment. That year, at an informal gathering following a brigade commander's conference, he told a group of colonels that included 2 people who knew my record in detail. "You know the deal. The Army had a quota to fill, and she was the most qualified woman on the list." Denise Okafor heard the comment. She was then a colonel herself, born February 8, 1973, and had been my closest professional peer since our overlapping time as majors at Fort Hood. She told me the next morning, word for word, with the directness I had come to rely on from her. She asked, "Is that what people think?" I said some people have always thought it. She said she knew, but I could see, watching her face, that she understood it landed differently when it was Baxter saying it, because Baxter had been in the room for 20 years of the evidence. He had access to the full record, and he was choosing anyway to tell a room full of colonels that the record was secondary to a quota. In 2014, I was selected for Early Brigade Command, 3rd Brigade, 82nd Airborne Division. Baxter was not selected in the same cycle. In 2015, David and I divorced after 17 years. He cited my permanent absence from the life we had built together. I did not publicly correct his framing. In 2017, newly frocked as a Brigadier General 07, I wrote a senior raider comment on Baxter's file recommending him for a specific joint staff assignment that would give him the most credible remaining path to general officer consideration. I did it because his professional competence was real and separate from his personal failings, and because my father believed those two things had to be kept separate, or neither meant anything. Baxter received the assignment. He never once asked how it had come through. 1 year later, when the Brigadier General promotion list was published and his name was absent and mine was present, he sent me a text message. "Congratulations. Must be nice." I read it twice. I did not respond. I tucked it into a pale yellow folder in the back drawer of my desk. I kept it there for 8 years because I needed, eventually, to be certain I had not imagined any of this. I needed proof that the pattern was real and that my memory of it was accurate and not a story I had told myself about someone who had simply moved on. The final image I carry from this period: my new Brigadier General office at the Pentagon, 1 star at my collar, that pale yellow folder in the back drawer, the drawer sliding shut with the soft certainty of a thing properly filed. I had spent 23 years extending credit to a man who used it freely and then questioned the bank. I was not finished yet, but something in me had taken careful, permanent note. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being professionally visible and personally unseen in the same institution at the same time. I was earmarked for stars. My evaluations were, without exception, among the strongest in any promotion pool I was considered in. And yet the man who had benefited most from my professional generosity had spent 2 decades building a private argument that the results were not actually mine. He had been present for all of it. He chose, year after year, to look past it. I filed that as information, the way I had always filed information I was not yet ready to act on. In a place I could find it again. By April of 2025, I was a Lieutenant General, 09, serving as Director of Operations on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon. 3 stars, the third most senior operational role in the United States Army. I was in daily contact with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense. I had spent 31 years becoming exactly what I had set out to become, at a cost I had counted and chosen and did not regret, even on the days when the counting was hard. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, I was at my desk in the E-ring by 06:45, reviewing the intelligence summary before the day's schedule took hold. I had a closed briefing with Senate Armed Services Committee staff at 0900, the kind of session that requires precision and no margin for interpersonal complication. I decided to get my own coffee before the briefing began. I have always done this. Since I was a second lieutenant standing in a Fort Bragg mess hall at 05:30 in the dark, I have gotten my own coffee. 31 years later, I saw no reason to stop. Rank doesn't make you above a coffee line. Rank makes you responsible for everyone standing in it. I told my aide-de-camp, Major Lien Chen, born April 22, 1988, 36 years old, and the most quietly efficient officer I had worked alongside in a decade, that I would meet her at the briefing room and that she should not wait for me. I buttoned my field jacket over my Army service uniform against the early spring chill that still lingered in the long corridors. The jacket covered my collar. My 3 silver stars, the Lieutenant General insignia, were not visible. I was a woman in a field jacket carrying nothing, walking toward a coffee line. Nothing about me was invisible if you were paying any attention at all, but nothing about me was announcing itself either. I preferred it that way. I had always preferred it that way. The A-ring cafeteria was busy at 07:15 on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I joined the line at the coffee station, which was briefly crowded in the way it gets when the morning rush hasn't thinned yet. 2 Marines were ahead of me, a corporal and his gunnery sergeant, both from the Marine Corps liaison desk on the 2nd floor of the building. I did not know their names then. I would know them before the morning ended. The corporal's name, I would learn shortly after, was Trent Wakeman, born September 5th, 2001, 23 years old, assigned to the liaison desk for 8 months. He was impatient in the particular way of a young enlisted man who has decided that moving quickly is the same as moving correctly and has not yet been corrected about the distinction. I reached for a cup at the coffee station at the same moment he moved past the person directly ahead of him in line. He did not look. His shoulder caught mine with more force than carelessness usually produces, the kind of impact that happens when someone has already decided that the space around them belongs to them and has not bothered to check. My hand went into the edge of the counter. The cup I had been reaching for overturned. Hot coffee ran across the back of my right hand. I did not gasp. I do not, in general, gasp. I steadied myself with my other hand on the pillar to my right and looked at him. He registered, belatedly, that he had made contact with another person. He glanced back at me. He took in whatever he saw, a woman in a field jacket, hand braced on a support pillar, coffee running off the edge of the counter, and he said, "I said move, honey." He did not lower his voice. He had not lowered it before, and he did not lower it now. His gunnery sergeant was standing approximately 2 steps behind him. The gunnery sergeant's name was Dale Pruitt, born July 12, 1979, 45 years old, 26 years of service in the Marine Corps. He looked at Wakeman. He looked at me. He chuckled, a sound that was low and amused rather than alarmed. He shook his head slightly, the precise gesture of a man who finds what he is watching entertaining rather than requiring any intervention. He did not say one word. The burn on my hand was real. The other thing, the laugh from behind, was what I actually felt in my chest. Not the corporal. He was 23 years old and genuinely did not know what he was looking at. The gunnery sergeant had 26 years in the Marine Corps. He knew exactly what he was doing and what he was choosing not to do. A gunnery sergeant who watches a subordinate Marine speak to a stranger with that kind of casual contempt and responds by chuckling has made a specific decision. It is not an accidental decision. It is a choice made in the full operational awareness of what the uniform requires of the person wearing it to decline to require it. At a corner table on the far side of the cafeteria, Colonel Andrew Ranch, born September 3, 1974, 50 years old, my G3 deputy and the most technically capable staff officer I had worked alongside at the 3-star level, was reviewing briefing slides on his laptop when his phone buzzed with a flash text. Major Chen had entered through the cafeteria's far door seconds earlier, assessed the situation at the coffee station in approximately 4 seconds, and sent the text. General Holbrook at coffee bar. Marine shoved her. Handle. Ranch went pale in the way of a man who understands immediately and completely what is at stake. He closed his laptop in a single motion and crossed the cafeteria with the controlled urgency of an officer who has spent a career learning to manage outcomes before they compound into something that cannot be managed at all. He placed himself between Wakeman and me, looked directly at the corporal, and spoke at a volume the entire room could hear without effort. "Corporal, step away from her. That is a lieutenant general." The cafeteria went still in the way that a room goes still when something irreversible has just been said aloud in it. Ranch did not hesitate, did not look around for permission or guidance, did not calculate the social cost before acting. He simply moved, because that is what the uniform requires. I noted who did it. I noted, equally carefully, who had not. Wakeman turned. For the first time that morning, he looked at the woman he had shoved. I had opened the top button of my field jacket. The 3 silver stars at my collar were fully visible. Whatever color remained in his face left it. Pruitt, 2 steps behind, came to a position of attention, the automatic, muscle memory attention that should have been present 2 minutes earlier, before he chuckled. A kitchen worker behind the counter quietly offered me a fresh cup of coffee on a clean paper napkin. I accepted it with a nod and a quiet thank you. Then I looked at Corporal Wakeman directly. My voice was not raised. It was not theatrical. It was simply the voice of someone who has been asked to account for things in places considerably more consequential than this cafeteria, and who understands that accountability does not require volume. I asked for his name, rank, and unit. He gave them. His voice cracked slightly on the unit designation, a small, involuntary tell. I nodded once to indicate I had heard him. I turned to Pruitt. "Gunnery Sergeant, you have a conversation to have with your Marine." I did not add anything to it, and he understood. I picked up my coffee and walked toward the door. I had a briefing in 11 minutes. I was on time. As I crossed the cafeteria toward the corridor, I passed within 8 feet of a table on the far side of the room. At that table sat Richard Baxter, Colonel, 06, 52 years old, a member of my J3 planning staff, a man I had known for 32 years. He was close enough to have seen the entire exchange from the moment of impact forward. He had not moved from his chair. He was looking at his phone. He looked up when I passed within his peripheral range. Our eyes met. He opened his mouth slightly, not quite forming a word, not quite beginning a gesture. Then he looked back down at the phone in his hands. Not the corporal, not the burn on my hand, not even the laugh from the gunnery sergeant, which had been the sharpest thing in the room. The man who had been in the room for 30 years, who had watched every deployment, benefited from every act of professional generosity I had extended to him, received assignments I had personally secured for him, and spent 2 decades chipping away at what I had built, chose, in the only moment in 30 years when something concrete was required of him, to look at his phone. That was the moment I stopped carrying anything for him at all. That was the moment I was done. The briefing with Senate Armed Services Committee staff went without incident. My hand was wrapped in a paper towel for the first hour. No one in that room mentioned it. I mentioned nothing. The session ran cleanly as I had prepared it to run. When it ended and the corridor cleared and I was walking back toward the E-ring alone, the weight of the morning settled in a way that had not registered during the briefing itself. The discipline of a closed-door session with Senate staff has a way of holding everything else at a controlled distance while you are inside it. The incident with the Marines was institutional and clear from the first moment. I knew exactly what happened next, and I knew because I had spent 31 years learning the architecture of accountability in the United States Army from the inside. The process existed for this precise reason. I would use it. There was never any question about that. What occupied the other part of my thinking as I walked back toward my office was a different and less tractable question. What to do about a man I had known for 30 years, who had been positioned 8 feet from a moment that required something of him and had chosen to offer nothing. I returned to my office at 11:30. Major Chen was at her desk outside, her posture careful, watching the door with the attention of someone who already knew most of the morning and was waiting to learn the rest. I sat down at my desk and opened my right hand and looked at the burn, a reddish line running across the back of 3 fingers, not deep enough to require more than a field dressing, but real enough to have registered the moment it happened. I asked Chen quietly to send for the staff duty medic. I did not ask her to file anything yet. While the medic worked on my hand, Chen placed a new cup of coffee on my desk without being asked. I looked at it for a moment before I drank it. I told her, "Draft me a sworn statement template. I'll fill in the details this evening." She nodded and didn't ask any of the questions she had every professional right to ask. I have always appreciated that about her, the understanding that some information moves in one direction at a time and that a good aide reads the direction correctly. My first call after a thing like that is never emotional. It is procedural. You document, you date it precisely, you describe it in plain, unambiguous language. Then, after the document is done and submitted through the right channel, if you still want to feel it, you feel it, but the document comes first. At 1400 hours, I called Major General Denise Okafor at her office at the Defense Intelligence Agency, where she served as Director of Analysis. Denise was born February 8, 1973, making her 52 years old at the time, 1 year younger than me, and, for the previous 20 years, the most reliably clear-eyed voice in my professional life. I gave her the full account in approximately 4 minutes. The push, the burn, the laugh from Pruitt, Ranch's intervention, and what he said when he said it. And, at the end, because the end was the part that mattered most, Baxter's table. Okafor was quiet for a moment after I finished. She did not offer sympathy first. She never leads with sympathy. What she asked was a practical question. Did anyone else note him sitting there? I said Ranch would have seen it clearly. She said, "Then you have options, multiple ones." We talked for another 20 minutes about the formal process for the cafeteria incident itself, the Marines, the sworn statement, the chain of notification that would follow from the moment the IG office received the document. The conversation about Baxter was shorter and clearer. She said, "You've been managing him for 30 years. You don't have to anymore." I didn't answer right away. Then, "I know." A pause that was real. I've known it for a while. That evening, I sat at my desk with the sworn statement draft in front of me on the government issue blotter and did not begin writing immediately. What happened instead, without my deciding to do it, was an inventory. I did not plan to take it. It simply came. Bosnia, 1996. No gender-integrated housing for the first 3 weeks of the deployment. I slept in a vehicle for 11 days, without complaint, because the complaint would have cost more than the vehicle, and because the mission was not about my comfort. Iraq, 2003, and then again in 2007, performing at the highest operational level of my career, to that point while my marriage came apart by degrees in an apartment I was in perhaps 40% of the time in any given year. When my father died on December 12, 2010, at the age of 70, from heart failure, I received the news over a satellite phone from a forward operating base in Logar Province, Afghanistan, at 2 p.m, local time. I was given 1 hour to sit with it before the next operational requirement. I took 40 minutes and went back to work because that was what the mission required and because my father would have done exactly the same thing and would have expected nothing less from me. The divorce, in 2015, publicly framed by David as a failure of my priorities rather than a consequence of my commitments, and I did not correct that framing in any setting where it might have made a practical difference, because correcting it would have spent energy I simply did not have to spare on outcomes I could not control. Every room where I had made myself quieter than I actually was, because quieter seemed like the path that cost less at the time. I did not cry during this inventory. I wrote the sworn statement. The line I had been circling all day became clear as I finished the last paragraph. Corporal Trent Wakeman had not known my rank. He had acted with casual contempt toward a stranger in a coffee line, the contempt of someone who has made a snap judgment and acted on it before the information was complete. That was ignorance, the correctable kind, the kind the system exists to address, and it was being addressed. Richard Baxter had known my rank, my record, my history, and every detail of my career for 32 years. He had been present for more of my professional life than almost anyone alive. And he had arrived via a longer route and with far more information at the same functional conclusion Wakeman had arrived at in 30 seconds. That I was someone who could be treated as if consequence didn't apply. That is not the same failure. The distinction matters. It had always mattered. And I was finished pretending otherwise. I signed the sworn statement. I placed it in a manila envelope and wrote, Aten IG CMD, on the face in my own handwriting with a ballpoint pen deliberately. I sealed the envelope. I placed it in the outbasket on my desk. I went home. The final image from that evening, a sealed manila envelope in an outbasket on a government-issue desk under fluorescent office light, the E-ring of the Pentagon visible through the window behind it at night. The building at night is quieter than most people who have never worked late in it would imagine. The institution is larger than any single morning in it, and the right thing, documented precisely and submitted through the correct channel, will outlast whatever made it necessary. I delivered the sworn statement to the Pentagon Inspector General's office at 0800 the morning after the incident, before my staff call, before the chairman's morning brief, before anything else on the day's schedule. I hand-delivered it rather than routing it through the mail system because some things should be handed over directly, and this was one of them. The JAG officer who received it at the front desk did a brief double-take when I introduced myself and stated my rank, and then he composed himself and proceeded with the professional efficiency his position required. I answered his preliminary questions in plain sentences. I signed where I was asked to sign. I was back at my own desk by 0840. The formal inquiry notification went up the Marine Corps chain of command within the same day. The office of the Commandant was notified. The Marine liaison desk on the second floor was placed on administrative hold. Corporal Wakeman and Gunnery Sergeant Pruitt were both formally served with notification of the pending inquiry before close of business. Major Chen tracked all administrative paperwork moving through the system and kept me informed with the spare efficiency that made her indispensable. I returned to my operational schedule without modification. The Senate Armed Services Committee briefing from the day before had generated a follow-up requirement needing a supplemental memo. The chairman's morning brief carried 3 unresolved action items from the previous week that had accumulated while other things took priority. A combatant command exercise was 3 weeks out, and the planning was running behind the timeline I had established at the start of the quarter. I filed the statement. I went back to work. Those 2 things are not in conflict with each other, and they never have been. I have spent 30 years being told, sometimes explicitly, sometimes in the architecture of a situation, that the way a woman handles being wronged is itself the measure she will be judged by, not the wrong. That was the measure I chose to offer. 4 days after the filing, Baxter appeared at the entrance of my office suite during a gap in my public calendar. He had checked the J3 staff portal, which displays the publicly accessible portion of the director's schedule, and chosen his moment accordingly. He asked Major Chen if he could speak with me for a few minutes. I told Chen to give him 5 minutes and to time it. He closed the door behind him. He began, "I just want to say, for what it's worth, that the way you handled Tuesday morning was exactly right. Professional, measured. You were exactly right." He paused in the way of someone who had rehearsed the next sentence more than once. I don't know that escalating this through the IG is going to help anyone in the end. These are junior Marines, their careers." I cut him off. Not sharply and not with heat. Precisely. "Richard, I am not asking for your view on the process." He tried a second approach. "I just don't want you to come out of this looking like you needed the intervention." I said, "That conversation is over." He left. His framing, "looking like you needed the intervention," was a restatement of the same diminishment he had been practicing in various forms for 30 years, applied now to my attempt to use an institutional accountability process the way it was designed to be used. It was a specific and recognizable argument that a woman who deploys institutional tools to address an institutional failure is diminishing herself by doing so, that the strong thing would have been to absorb it and move forward without creating a record. I had encountered that argument in various configurations throughout my career. I had even, in certain earlier and more forgiving moments, given it partial credence. I did not give it any credence anymore, not one fraction. After Baxter left, I sat at my desk for 90 seconds without moving. Then I asked Major Chen to come in. I dictated a supplemental memorandum, entirely separate from the cafeteria incident report, documenting Baxter's approach to my office suite, the specific language he had used, his suggestion that I withdraw from or soften the formal process, and my clear understanding of his intent in making that suggestion. The language was factual throughout. The time of the approach, the content of the words, the context in which they were delivered. I noted that Colonel Baxter was an assigned member of my J3 planning staff and that his approach to me constituted an attempt to influence the outcome of an active inquiry. I did not characterize it beyond those facts. I signed the memorandum, I sent it to the J1 personnel office with a copy routed to my own command group. Chen, typing the transmittal email, asked, "Do you want me to flag this as urgent priority?" I said, "Standard routing is fine." Then, "But don't let it sit on anyone's desk past tomorrow morning." I didn't retain outside legal counsel. I didn't reach out to anyone in my chain above me. I documented what happened in factual language and sent it through the correct institutional channel, the same way I had been using the institutional system for 31 years, the same way I would use it for however many years remained. The system is imperfect. I have been aware of its imperfections since I was a second lieutenant. But I have spent 31 years building a professional reputation, founded in part on using the system correctly and consistently, regardless of convenience, and I was not going to stop doing that on this particular morning because it happened to be inconvenient. 3 weeks after the initial filing, I received a phone call from a 2-star general I had admired professionally since my major years, a man of genuine intelligence and long institutional memory, who chose his words with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much weight each one carried. He used my first name, which was itself a signal about the register of the conversation. "I'm not asking you to drop it," he said. "I'm asking you to think carefully about what you want the story to be going forward. Right now, the story is a 3-star general and a corporal. I don't want that to become the lens through which people read your career." I was quiet for a moment, giving the question the respect it deserved before I answered it. Then I said, "General, with respect, that's exactly the reason it has to stay in the system. If I withdraw it, or allow it to go quietly unresolved, the story becomes something else. It becomes, she didn't think it was worth the trouble. I do think it is worth the trouble. I think the trouble is the point." He said, "Understood." He did not call again. He wasn't wrong that there would be a cost. There always is, for everything worth doing. But I had spent 30 years paying costs that belonged to other people. This cost was mine, and I was entirely willing to pay it. The final image from those weeks. My desk, late at night, The light on my computer screen the only source of illumination in the room, a cursor blinking at the end of a sent items confirmation in the email system. The E-ring corridors were silent outside the window. I had not backed down from a single position I had taken. I did not feel triumphant about that. I felt clear, which is different from triumphant in a way that matters, and which is, in my experience, the better thing to feel. The summer of 2025 brought 3 separate and distinct reckonings, one for the corporal, one for the gunnery sergeant, and one for the colonel. I watched none of them from close range or with any personal involvement in their specific outcomes. I had handed the process to the institutions I had served for 31 years, and I trusted that those institutions, operating at their own pace and according to their own procedures, would do precisely what they had been built to do. In early June, the administrative proceedings for the cafeteria incident concluded. Corporal Trent Wakeman, 23 years old, 8 months assigned to the Pentagon liaison desk, and possessed of a judgment that had not yet caught up with his confidence, was reduced in rank to Private First Class, E2, and reassigned out of the Pentagon to a non-priority duty station that would not feature prominently in any account of his service. Gunnery Sergeant Dale Pruitt, 45 years old, 26 years of Marine Corps service, 11 months remaining before his planned retirement date, received non-judicial punishment under the applicable Marine Corps process. A formal letter of reprimand entered into his permanent record, a reduction in pay for 2 consecutive months, and an administrative annotation on his service record that made future promotion to Master Sergeant, E8, effectively and permanently foreclosed. He had planned a particular kind of final year of service before retirement. Those 11 months would not resemble what he had planned. That was the institutional answer to the specific choice he had made when he chuckled at the coffee station and looked away from a situation he had both the rank and the responsibility to correct. The notifications of both outcomes arrived at my office via a brief administrative memorandum from the J1 office, delivered through normal routing channels. I read the memorandum. I placed it face down on my desk so the text was not visible. I returned to the operational brief I had been preparing for the following morning's chairman's session. I said nothing to anyone in the office that day about what the memorandum contained. I did not feel triumph or vindication when I read it. I felt something quieter and more lasting, something in the vicinity of, this is what it looks like when the process functions as it is supposed to function, and this is why you do not back away from it when the pressure to do so is applied. The system processed what I had handed it. On 2 service records, there were now permanent notations that said this happened, that it was documented, and that it was treated as the matter it actually was. Richard Baxter's supplemental memorandum, the one documenting his approach to my office and his suggestion that I withdraw from the formal inquiry, was reviewed by the J1 Personnel Office and referred to the Army G1 Inspector for evaluation. No formal adverse action was ultimately recommended, in part because Baxter was then approximately 7 months from his own planned retirement date, and the institutional calculus for formal action at that stage of a career points in a particular direction. But his Pentagon Joint Staff assignment was terminated several months ahead of its scheduled end date, and he was reassigned to a terminal administrative posting at a reserve component headquarters in a different state, a posting with no meaningful operational function and no path to anything beyond itself. He was not relieved for cause. No adverse notation appeared in his final record. He was simply moved, and moved quietly, and moved to somewhere that carried its own unmistakable meaning to anyone in the building who understood how these things worked. In the military, being moved, quietly, early, without stated reason, to somewhere that doesn't require anyone to explain the posting, is its own kind of verdict. Every officer in that building who paid attention understood what the move signified. He understood it. I was informed of the outcome by my command group's chief of staff in a single sentence at the end of a morning brief appended to the regular administrative items. I nodded. I moved to the next item on the agenda. Over July and August, 14 letters and emails arrived through official military correspondence channels at my office. They came from junior female officers distributed across the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. Mostly captains and majors, several lieutenant colonels, a few more senior. None of them knew the specific and accurate details of what had happened on that Tuesday morning in April. Most of them referenced a version of the story that had been moving through various Pentagon liaison desks in staff corridors without my name attached to it, because my name had never needed to be attached to it. One letter arrived from a first lieutenant stationed in Germany, and it contained only a single sentence. "Thank you for not letting it go." Major Chen presented the correspondence to me and asked what I wanted done with it. Protocol did not allow for personal responses through official military mail channels. I told her. File it in a separate folder, not in the institutional record. Just keep it somewhere I can find it. Not for documentation purposes, just to keep. I have never been someone who does things in order to send a message to a wider audience. That has never been the motivation, and it was not the motivation here. I did what I did because it was the correct thing to do, applied to a situation that required it. But the letters told me something the institutional memorandum had not. Something that the formal process, operating as it does on facts and findings and annotated records, is not designed to convey. That the correct thing, when you see it through the institutional process, without flinching and without retreating under pressure, lands somewhere beyond the record. It reaches people who needed it to reach them and who will carry it forward in ways you will never see directly and do not need to see. That was, in the end, the part that mattered most. In September of 2025, I was invited to speak on a panel at a Pentagon-hosted Judge Advocate General Conference on institutional accountability in the modern military. I was not the keynote. I was one of 4 panelists. I did not reference the cafeteria incident by name or by implication. I spoke for 12 minutes about the practical difference between formal authority and actual authority, and about the specific obligation that attaches to senior leaders to use institutional processes rather than bypass them when bypass is more convenient. Near the end of my 12 minutes, I said, "The moment a leader decides that the system is too costly or too complicated to use on their own behalf, they have communicated to every junior person in their chain that the system is optional. It is not optional. It is the only thing we have, standing between the authority of rank and the impunity that rank can otherwise produce." The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something true has been said aloud in them. Not dramatic, not performative quiet, but the quiet of recognition, of people who have needed to hear that sentence said with clarity by someone who was standing behind every word of it. Afterward, 3 officers approached me separately at different moments during the reception. None of them mentioned the incident. They did not need to. The final image from that summer, the podium, the room still after my last line, 14 officers in the front rows who would carry that sentence back to their units in 3 different services. I stepped back from the microphone without waiting for the applause to develop. The work was done. I had somewhere to be. Richard Baxter submitted a formal meeting request in early October of 2025, approximately 3 months after his reassignment out of the Pentagon. He did not approach me informally or through a mutual acquaintance or by appearing unannounced at my office suite a second time. He went through the correct channel, a written meeting request submitted to Major Chen's official correspondence queue, annotated in the subject line as a personal and professional matter requiring 30 minutes. He was writing from his terminal posting in Delaware. Chen presented the request to me without adding any interpretation of her own, which was itself a form of interpretation and the correct one. I looked at the request for a moment. I said, "Schedule it for the next time he is in the building for out-processing." She scheduled it. Over the 2 weeks between the scheduling and the meeting, I did not mention Baxter's name to anyone. Not to Chen, not to Okafor when we spoke by phone, not to Ranch when we reviewed the week's operational requirements. I did not rehearse what I intended to say. I did not seek advice about the meeting from anyone whose judgment I trusted. I gave him 30 minutes because I have always held the view that the final word, when someone is willing to speak it plainly, is worth hearing, even when you already have a clear sense of what your own response will be. He arrived at the Pentagon on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October, in the last week of his active duty service before terminal leave began. He was in uniform. He looked tired in a way that was distinct from the ordinary fatigue of a long career, the specific exhaustion of someone who has been in sustained conversation with something they have long avoided, and has recently lost the capacity to continue avoiding it. He sat across from me at the small conference table. He did not use my first name. He said, "General, I owe you more than I have ever given you credit for. I have known that for a long time. I did not act on it that morning in the cafeteria because I did not know what to do in the moment, and I took the easiest available path. I am not going to describe that in any way that makes it sound better than what it was. He paused, and the pause was real. Then, I also need to tell you the things I said over the years about your promotions, about the system working in your favor. I knew those things were wrong when I was saying them. I said them anyway, more times than I have been willing to count, and I'm sorry for them. I let the silence sit after he finished before I answered it. I have learned over 31 years that silence after an important statement is not empty. It is the space where the statement settles into something real, rather than something performed. I hear you, Richard, I said, and I believe you mean what you are saying. Another beat of silence, deliberate. But I want to be honest with you about something. What you have just described to me is not a single momentary failure of judgment or nerve. It was a pattern that ran across more than 20 years. And the pattern is what matters here, more than the apology, as genuine as I believe it to be. He did not argue or qualify or retreat into explanation. He nodded in the way of someone who has already had exactly this conversation with himself and arrived at the same conclusion and is no longer surprised to hear it spoken aloud by someone else. After a moment, he started to ask, "Is there anything?" and stopped before completing it. I answered what I understood him to be asking. "I am not interested in rebuilding a personal relationship," I said. "I don't believe we ever had the foundation for one, if I'm being honest with myself about the history. What we had was a professional relationship that I significantly overinvested in, and that you significantly undervalued, sometimes in ways that cost me concretely. If our paths cross at a retirement ceremony or a professional conference, I will be entirely professional with you. I will always be professional. But I am finished extending credit that I no longer have any basis for extending." I stood. I extended my hand across the table. He shook it, firm, not warm, not hostile. The handshake of two people who have known each other for 32 years and are finally saying something truthful about what those 32 years actually constituted. He left. I sat back down. I looked at the back drawer of my desk, the drawer that had contained a pale yellow folder for 8 years. I had thrown the folder away in the first week of October, the morning after I decided I would agree to take the meeting. The drawer was empty. I had noticed that several times since, each time with a faint expectation of feeling something specific about the absence. I did not feel something specific. I felt nothing where something heavy used to be, and the absence of that weight was its own information. I shook his hand, and I meant it in the way you mean a handshake with someone you have permanently settled your account with. There is a difference between professional civility extended in good faith and trust earned over time. He had spent the latter a long time ago. I had simply, for too long, allowed myself to behave as if the difference didn't matter. The day after the meeting, I had lunch with Denise Okafor at a restaurant near the Pentagon. Not in uniform, not at any government facility, just two women at a corner table on a Wednesday afternoon. I told her the 30 minutes in full. What he said, what I said, the handshake at the end. She listened without once interrupting, which is a specific discipline not everyone is capable of. When I finished, she asked, "How do you feel?" I gave the question the genuine consideration it deserved, rather than reaching for an automatic answer. "Lighter," I said after a moment. "Not happy about it, not sad about it, just lighter, in a way that feels accurate rather than performed." She nodded. "Good," she said. "You were carrying his weight for 30 years. You can put it down now." We ordered lunch. We talked about her daughter's college application process and about a joint exercise I was coordinating that was generating more inter-service friction than the timeline could reasonably absorb. We laughed about something she said involving a general officer who had hand-delivered a note containing the phrase, "per my previous email." The relief in the room was not dramatic or ceremonial. It was the quiet relief of a meal with someone you trust completely, during which nothing in the space between you needs to be managed or performed or carefully maintained. She was right. I had been carrying his weight for 30 years, longer than I had allowed myself to fully acknowledge. The particular difficulty of weight that accumulates gradually, increment by increment over years, is that by the time you understand what you're actually carrying, it has become part of your posture. You've forgotten what standing without it feels like. You've started to believe that the additional effort is simply what standing costs. The final image: Denise and me at a corner table in a bright restaurant, no uniforms, no rank visible, laughing at something that was not, in any way, heavy. By November of 2025, the cafeteria was a story people told in the third person, in quiet settings without attribution. My name was almost never attached to the telling, not because any effort had been made to suppress it, but because the kind of accountability I had pursued through the formal process does not require a name to establish its meaning or its weight. What it requires is a documented record, a system willing to receive and process that record, and an officer willing to stand behind what she filed without retreating under pressure. I had provided all three of those things. The story circulated in the building without me in it, and that was exactly what I had intended it to be. My days in November and December carried the same operational weight they had always carried at the 3-star level, but something in the texture of them had shifted in a way I was still learning to name. The back drawer of my desk was empty. I had stopped conducting the internal calculation, the ongoing automatic assessment of what each professional interaction might cost me before I engaged in it fully. The building felt more accurately proportioned to what I actually was, rather than to some reduced version of myself I had long been maintaining for reasons I had stopped being able to justify. November in the Pentagon has a specific and recognizable texture for anyone who has worked long years in it. The corridors go quiet earlier in the evenings as the days shorten. The heating runs warm and slightly dry in the way of old government buildings that have been retrofitted but never fully resolved. The cycle of budget submissions and combatant command reviews compresses the calendar into something relentless and clarifying, in which everything non-essential falls away, and what remains is the work itself. I was in the building by 0640 on most mornings. I still got my own coffee from the cafeteria before the 0700 brief. Both times I returned to the A-Ring cafeteria. After April, I chose the corner table where Ranch usually set up to review his slides before the morning meeting. There was no symbolic reason for the choice. I simply preferred the corner, which has always offered a clear view of the room. I ordered my coffee, paid for it, and sat with the intelligence summary until the brief required me to move. Nobody pushed me. Nobody would. The room was the same room it had always been. I was different in it, not larger or louder, but occupying, for the first time in a long time, all of my actual available space. In early December, I called my mother on a Sunday evening. Eleanor Graves, born June 5th, 1945, 80 years old since the previous summer and as direct in her thinking as she had been at 40. We spoke by phone most Sunday evenings. I had not told her the complete and accurate story of what had happened in April until that call. I had offered fragments that there had been an incident, that it had been handled, that I was fine, but I had not given her the full account. On that Sunday evening in December, I gave it to her. The push, the burn on my hand, the laugh from the gunnery sergeant, Ranch crossing the cafeteria, Baxter at his table with his phone, the October meeting, the handshake, all of it. She listened without interrupting, which is a discipline she has practiced my entire life and which I have only recently begun to fully appreciate as the gift it is. When I finished, she said quietly, "Your father would have been very proud of how you handled all of it." I said, "Which part specifically?" She said, "All of it, including the part where you put it down." There was a pause. Then she said, "Are you eating enough?" I laughed. It was the most unguarded laugh I had produced in months. The laugh of someone who has just been completely understood by the one person most qualified to understand them, and has then had the conversation returned in the most loving possible way, to something ordinary and human and necessary. In mid-December, following the chairman of the Joint Chiefs morning brief, he asked me to remain for a brief private conversation. He mentioned, off the record, without formal notification or documentation, that my name had appeared on a preliminary consideration list being developed for a 4th-star billet. "Nothing official at this point," he said. "Early days, and nothing is decided. But I wanted you to know it was being discussed, and I want you to start thinking about where you would want to be positioned if the consideration moves forward." I said, "I appreciate the advance notice, General. I'll think about it carefully." I returned to my office. I closed the door behind me. I sat at my desk without moving for a full minute. 4 stars. General, O10, the highest active rank in the United States Army. My father had retired at Colonel 06. He would have gone further if the army he served in had made the path available to him. Some roads were shorter then, and for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of the person standing at the beginning of them. I was 53 years old. I had been in uniform for 31 years. And the news that my name was under preliminary consideration for 4 stars did not produce in me the feeling of triumph that I might have expected at 22. It produced something more complex, quieter, not yet fully legible, even to me. Something that was perhaps the beginning of understanding what comes after you have finished becoming what you set out to become. On New Year's Eve of 2025, I was alone in my apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, with a glass of wine and the balcony door open an inch against the cold. The lights of the Potomac Basin were visible in the middle distance. I was not cataloging the year in any organized or ceremonial way. I was simply present in the room with a glass of wine and the open balcony door, which is harder to achieve at 53 than it was at 22, and correspondingly more valuable. I thought about my father at the kitchen table in Kansas explaining weight. I thought about Richard Baxter at 21 telling me sincerely that I had done most of the work. I thought about the coffee burn on my hand, which had healed completely months ago. There was a small, pale scar at the base of my ring finger that I had largely stopped noticing. And I sat with the question I had not yet answered. What does it actually mean to lead fully, without the constant low-grade management of yourself downward, for someone who has spent 31 years making room for everyone else in every room she entered? I didn't answer it that night. I finished the wine, I went inside. I set my alarm for 0600. The question was still present when I closed my eyes. For the first time in a very long time, that did not feel like something I needed to resolve immediately in order to sleep. The new year arrived in the quiet and unceremonious way of most significant changes, without announcement, simply present when you looked for it. And with it came something I had not had unobstructed access to in a long time, the open, unmanaged feeling of a life that belonged to me in its actual dimensions, not in some reduced form I had been maintaining to accommodate the comfort of people who were not worth the reduction. Not the rank itself, the rank had always been mine, earned year by year through work I could account for precisely. What I mean is the life underneath the rank. The early mornings I had always liked and was now allowing myself to like without reservation. The team I had built around me and was now giving the full benefit of my actual personality rather than the managed version. The mother I was calling more often, not out of obligation, but because I had stopped treating the calls as time I was taking from somewhere else. The first week of January brought the post-holiday operational acceleration that is a reliable feature of the Pentagon calendar, the budget cycle reasserting itself, the combatant commands recalibrating, the chairman's schedule filling in at a rate that required constant management. I ran my 0700 brief with the efficiency I had maintained for 2 years as director. What was different, quietly, in a way I noticed but did not make a point of, was the quality of the room itself. They had watched me file the statement and go back to work and not make it a larger story than it needed to be. And they had drawn their own conclusions from that sequence. At the end of the week's final brief on a Friday afternoon, I thanked the staff and told them, "Good work this week. Go home at a reasonable hour." Ranch looked up from his notes with the dry, precise expression I had come to rely on as an indicator of his actual state of mind. "Defining reasonable," he said. I laughed. The room laughed, not politely but genuinely. I have always had a sense of humor about the work. I have not always allowed it to be visible in professional settings, because visible humor in a woman of senior rank is a thing that certain people in certain rooms have historically been waiting to use against her. I was no longer adjusting for those people. My humor was in the room now, and it was going to stay there. In February of 2026, a personnel administration packet arrived on my desk through a chain of escalations that had moved through the Army system over several weeks. A first lieutenant named Amara Reyes, born March 3, 2001, 24 years old, had been recommended for a career-threatening administrative separation following a disputed incident with a superior officer. Her service record was strong, consistently high evaluations, a recent commendation from a deployed exercise, no prior adverse documentation. The investigation that formed the basis of the recommendation was notable primarily for what it had not examined. I read the complete packet. I called the branch officer and asked 2 questions. Is the record clean? It was. Was the investigation complete? It was not, in any meaningful sense. I directed a full supplemental review before any further action was taken. She would never know my name appeared on the routing slip. I was not doing it to be known. I was doing it because a fair process, applied correctly and completely, is the only practical thing standing between a promising officer and a bad morning that should not have been allowed to become a permanent record. I had personal knowledge of what that distance felt like from the inside. I would know. On February 15th, 2026, I turned 54 years old. I took a long weekend and drove to Athens, Georgia, to spend it with my mother. Denise Okafor drove down from Washington on the day itself. The dinner Eleanor made was simple in the way of things that have been thought about carefully. Something in the pot since noon, bread from the bakery 2 blocks away, a bottle of wine I had been carrying since a working trip to Germany nearly 2 years earlier, saving it for an occasion that justified it without quite knowing what that occasion would look like. We ate at the kitchen table, the specific one that Eleanor Graves had kept across 11 military installations and the long years since, the table at which the consistent work of a family's life had been conducted, with a reliability that made it feel like the most stable point in a life organized around change. After dinner, Denise raised her glass and said, "To the woman who didn't back down." I raised mine and looked across the table at my mother when I said, "To the woman who made the table." Eleanor shook her head with the small, precise motion she has always used to decline credit she considers excessive. "I just kept the table," she said. I said, "That's the whole thing." She looked at me for a moment with the expression that is uniquely hers, not pride exactly, because pride implies a slight distance, and this was not that. And then she poured herself a second glass of wine, and the evening continued in the way of evenings that are simply, without qualification, good. In March of 2026, on an ordinary morning in the middle of the month, I walked the A-ring corridor at my customary hour. Earlier than most of the building, later than the maintenance staff, in the particular quiet of the Pentagon before the full operational day has asserted itself. Coffee in hand from the cafeteria, where nothing notable had occurred and no one had pushed me. 3 silver stars, visible at my open collar. I walked the full length of the A-ring without altering my pace or my attention when I passed the pillar where I had steadied myself 11 months earlier. It was a pillar. The corridor was a corridor. I had walked this building for 31 years, across multiple assignments and rank levels and states of mind, and I would walk it for however many years and whatever rank level remained. I walked past that pillar on a morning in March and did not think about April. I thought about my father's voice at a kitchen table in Kansas, explaining what wait actually means and why it is the point rather than the obstacle. I thought about my mother at the sewing machine in the corner of that same kitchen, not looking up from the needle, delivering the rule she had always lived by. I thought about the 14 letters in the folder in the second drawer of my desk, and I thought, 31 years, 3 stars, a hand that healed completely, a drawer that is finally empty. That is not a story about what someone did to me in a cafeteria on a Tuesday morning in April. That is a story about what I refused to allow to define me over 31 years of choosing, every morning, to keep becoming the thing I had set out to become, and about what I finally allowed myself to be, fully and without reduction, when I was ready to stop managing myself down to fit the space that other people had decided I should occupy. Whoever pushed you into a pillar, into a corner, into a smaller version of yourself than you were born to inhabit, they were not the last word. You are. You always were. You just needed long enough to stop letting them finish your sentences. The corridor was quiet at that hour. My footsteps were the only sound for the length of 3 rings. I did not walk more slowly or more quickly than I always walked. The coffee in my hand was the same temperature it always was. And the building, the particular, inescapable weight of this building and what it requires of anyone who works inside it and means what they are doing, felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it was simply where I worked. Not a place I was proving something in, not a place I was managing something through. Just a building where I came every morning to do the work I had spent 31 years learning how to do well. That was the whole of it. That was more than enough. I spent years believing strength meant carrying the weight quietly, but sometimes real strength is knowing when to put it down. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who kept taking more than they gave? Have you ever stayed silent too long just to keep the peace? Tell me your story in the comments. And if this reminded you of your own fight to reclaim your worth, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me for the next story.